This is where I want you to put your imagination to work. This peaceful plot of ground, this poplars in the distance, I want you to imagine crowded with 32,000 men, lined up in rows, dressed only in a thin shirt and trousers, while the sleet descends and a biting east wind blows, condemned to stand motionless for an hour or more while the Nazis counted them. Because this is Dachau concentration camp, the first of Germany's concentration camps, set up originally for political prisoners, but by the end holding gypsies to be exterminated, Russian soldiers to be shot, Jews, every kind of undesirable that the Nazi regime could lay hold of. We will never know the exact number of prisoners killed here. It was not an extermination camp. The gas ovens, that I'll show you later on, although built, were never actually put into use because the war ended too soon. But Russian prisoners were used as target practice by the Nazi guards. Horrible medical experiments were conducted on helpless prisoners here. And prisoners were killed just routinely as a matter of course, as punishment for the slightest infraction of the camp rules or even imagined infraction. If the guard didn't happen to like your face, or the way you walked, or something like that. There were hangings, there were beatings, there was starvation. Every means that warped and perverted human minds could think of was used here to kill thousands upon thousands of prisoners. This line of railway track, and this rather battered bit of concrete, is all that remains of Dachau railway station. But you need to imagine it as it was in its heyday, with a long line of cattle trucks drawn up here, and on the station, guards in uniform, with growling dogs, driving the prisoners out of the cattle trucks with blows and threats, even dragging out the dead bodies of those who had died on the way. And then the prisoners being marshalled on the platform and marched down through that gate there with its sinister inscription, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. This is the reception room where arriving prisoners were first dealt with. These tables, which now house display exhibitions, were the places where the prisoners were ordered to undress, rushed out of their clothes, registered and processed. It's amazing how clothes make the man. Once you've lost your clothes, you lose a part of your identity, as can be seen in these photographs of a prominent Jewish performer before and after his arrival. I've seen it happen in hospitals, where a person comes in fully dressed and is given a hospital gown to wear, and as soon as he puts it on, he passes from the category of person to the category of patient. Here it was worse. You passed from the category of person to the category of prisoner, to be abused and maltreated in any way that the guards pleased. The naked men were herded out of the reception room into this room, which was the baths. Here they were showered with cold water, it need hardly be said. But this room had a more sinister purpose, because between these pillars there were beams, and prisoners who had offended against the camp rules would have their hands bound behind their backs, and then a chain and hook was used to haul them up to the ceiling, so that their hands, their arms were stretched up behind them, dislocating their shoulders, and they would be left to hang there for an hour or even 2 hours in excruciating agony. And this is where the prisoners slept. I want you to imagine 250 men crammed into these 3 layers of bunks, so-called. Each man lying lengthwise on the bunk with only a thin coverlet to cover him and straw for a mattress. This is where they lived, this is where they slept. In front of me is the living quarters with the table where they would eat their meals. Spartan accommodation for so many men. And towards the end of the camp, of course, when the numbers here had increased from 6,000 to 32,000, the overcrowding doesn't bear to be imagined. And this is where the several thousand men housed in these barracks were expected to wash. And to encourage greater haste, for whatever reason, the last man was hung, with his hands behind his back, hung in the baths or out in the forest from a tree. No reason, no deliberate intention to disobey the camp rules, just the last man. There were scores of barrack blocks. They've since been demolished and only their foundations remain. This is where the prisoners were housed. And any who tried to escape, you can see behind me one of the guard towers, where death was dealt out to anyone who strayed over the line. And if the guards missed them, the electric fences got them. But of all the buildings at Dachau, this attractive brick building, set in a patch of woodland just outside the main camp, is perhaps the most sinister. For this was the crematorium, where the bodies of those who died in the camp were disposed of. As the number of murders increased, a second crematorium was built larger than the first. And then a gas chamber was added, though that was never used, but only because the war ended before it could be. Eventually, as the war drew to its climax and supplies of coal became harder to find, the crematorium too was disused, and prisoners killed were buried. 14,000 buried prisoners have been found. Only God knows how many were burned in the crematorium. This room is where the prisoners were brought, or were intended to be brought. Accounts differ on whether anyone was actually poisoned here or not. Some camp survivors say that small groups were poisoned here by gas. So the groups were brought here into this room where they were stripped, their clothing taken next door to be fumigated, and they were instructed in how to behave in the showers. Supposedly, when the water started, they were to rub themselves down and get clean all over. And then they were herded through that door into the actual killing chamber. And so the doomed prisoners lined up underneath the supposed shower heads, waiting for the water to come, instead of which came the dreaded Zyklon B gas. The fittings, the shower heads and other fittings, were all stolen after the war as grisly souvenirs. But there can be no doubt that this is what this room was for, because it exactly matches other rooms at extermination camps such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, Birkenau. And these are the ovens or furnaces where the bodies were burned to ashes. So nothing remained of the individual, completely gone. There's 4 altogether, And above, in the roof, there are beams with hooks in them. With grim efficiency, formal executions, as opposed to random murders, were carried out by hanging here, directly in front of the furnaces, so that as soon as you were dead, your body was put into the furnace, loaded onto one of the iron trays, and pushed into where the flames awaited you. We click our tongues in horror over the atrocities that were carried out here, but we need to remember the concentration camps were invented by the British. The Russians have their own history of arbitrary arrest, imprisonment, torture, and death. The Americans have Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib. It's not German inhumanity to man, it's man's inhumanity to man. And that is why we honor those few individuals of every nation who stand up for truth, justice, and right. As, for example, Oberstaatsanwalt Karl Winterberger, who was an official in Munich, coroner, I suppose we would call him, or a district prosecutor, who insisted on carrying out autopsies on the bodies of those who were reported dead here at Dachau, and even instituted proceedings for murder against the commandant and personnel of the camp. Needless to say, he quickly lost his job. And no one seems to know what happened to him. We believe he survived the war, but we don't know. He deserved a medal. Dachau concentration camp was a horrible place, with its arbitrary arrests and punishments, its tortures, its medical experiments that really were just another form of torture, and its killings. You know what it reminds me of? Life here on Earth. Aren't there thousands of people who suffer arbitrarily through no fault of their own? Isn't there torture, death, suffering, pain? And there's no escape. There were survivors from Dachau, but from Earth, there are no survivors. Everyone dies in the end. But one glad day in 1945, the American troops arrived and liberated the prisoners in Dachau camp. And they walked free, rejoicing that they had survived. And the Bible promises that one day there will be another army of liberation, sweeping down from the skies to bring deliverance to the inhabitants of planet Earth. What a day of rejoicing that will be. No more death, no more suffering, no more sorrow. I want to be ready for that day. I hope it will be soon, and that when it comes, I'll be on the right side, because here in Dachau there were those who were not on the right side, those who feared and hated the approaching American forces. Many of them were summarily executed by the Americans when they arrived, so disgusted were they at what they saw. There will be those who will not accept the return of Christ. Scripture tells us they will be so terrified they'll cry out to the mountains and rocks to fall on them and hide them. But there will be others who lift up their heads and say, "Lo, this is our God. We have waited for him, and he will save us."